mistaken.
Don't
You think relationships are fair?
do no, life isn't fair.
Yeah,
So
so why would
relationship
you sit there and say that's not fair when you know darn well relationships and life ain't fair? Relationships ain't never gonna be fair.
no. Well, yeah, but I think there are certain things that you can do to, make situations better. So well, first thing before I get to that, Doug Will took the words out my mouth. He said, "Direct, yes; blunt, not necessarily." Yeah,
Okay, maybe next
yeah.
time.
I think you
I
should do both.
definitely, because blunt can be taken a certain way too that may go left. Because I remember having a conversation before I was leaving one of my other schools with a principal about, certain things or whatever. Because I am a very direct person. And he made the comment that, like, I know that, you are upfront with people and you're blunt, but that I know you're from New York, like that kind of thing. And, people may not necessarily read it the right way. And I'm like, what are you talking? You know what I'm saying? Like, what are you talking about in regards to that? So I think there's a difference between being blunt and being direct. You don't want to be misinterpreted as being disrespectful. And I think it can be interpreted as being disrespectful. But in terms of what you were saying about things being fair, no, I do not think that life is fair all the time. But I also think that you should strive to be fair as an individual as best you can. So if I would expect you to explain something to me or what have you, then on my end, I need to be doing the same thing to you. I can't expect you to do something that I wouldn't even hold myself accountable for.
Well, I
So
disagree with that slightly because how women move and how men move are different. Like,
But the standard isn't.
no, the standard is definitely different.
No, if you expect me to communicate to you, now the way I communicate to you may be different, but the idea behind the communication is to make something clear in terms of our standards or our boundaries, right? Because that's what we were talking about. So the way I may go about making my standards or my boundaries clear to you in the way that I communicate that may look a little different, but the premise of it is still the same from your end or mine. You may be blunt, but I may be more subtle about it, but we're still trying to communicate the same thing about what our boundaries are. That's what I mean.
I understand.
so uh, I don't necessarily agree with that, right? Because I think there's what's fair and then there's what's right. Fair tends to be really subjective, and I think that's where people kind of get into muddy waters. Whereas I think if we focus on being more righteous and less about being fair, then we give better opportunities for our relationships to thrive, romantic and otherwise, right? So, like, I have this thing that, like, not everything that's uncomfortable is bad for you, right? Sometimes receiving feedback or criticism doesn't feel good, but it's the right thing to do because that's the right thing for a relationship. Work, romantic, friendships, whatever relationship, right? It's the right thing to do. It's the same difference between being blunt and being direct, right? There's a certain level of respect that differentiates the two, because you could say whatever you want, and like what comes to mind with blunt is like, I'm just being brutally honest. The truth doesn't have to be brutal, right? It could be uncomfortable, that's fine, but it doesn't have to be brutal, especially when you're communicating it to somebody that you say you care about, right? The directness is just that there's clarity involved without all of the unnecessary amounts of, room for disrespect.
I think that when the term brutal gets used, it just depends on the person who's receiving those words. Because oftentimes, like if you hear certain people say certain things, it might seem brutal, but like depending on how that person receives it, like if you say certain direct things to somebody that's from New York, you're gonna get a very different response. Versus if you say that same response to say somebody in like Alabama, some people in Alabama. You're going to, depending on that person's internal disposition to what is being said, something that you would consider brutal in one area or one person is not going to be brutal to another person, because this is
So,
my experience. In my
so
experience, even being tactful and trying to, speak in a language that a woman would understand and be more willing to take and receive, once she understands what the message is, depending on how she's feeling in that moment, it still could possibly induce the same thing you were trying to prevent by actually trying to communicate in a way that she understands. Once you understand what the message is, how you going to respond to it is how you're going to respond for it. Whether I said, you go on a job interview and you be like, hey, you did a great interview, you had a good time. However, you can't get the job. Or if you said, hey, you did a fantastic job, but I don't think you're going to be a good fit. Those words, in some people's mind, feel dramatically different, but the results is the same. Once you realize I did not get the job, that this ain't going the way that I want, you can have a very negative reaction to that whole entire situation.
so that goes to what I was saying, right? Like, the truth can be uncomfortable, and the person receiving that needs to be the thing that they navigate through. When people say brutal honesty, it's the deliverer of the message and not the receiver. That there is no regard for that person's feelings in the way that they deliver the message. So in that same example that you gave, that would be like the interviewer being like, no, this was a trash interview. Like, it wasn't good. You're not getting the job. Please leave. Versus like, hey, thank you for your time. These are the reasons we won't be moving forward with you. However you want to phrase that second one, right? That is somebody who is being direct versus somebody being brutally honest. Brutally honest usually comes with, your feelings are not going to get in the way of the way that I want to tell you this message. Brutally honest is never, I've never heard somebody on the receiving end explain what somebody said is brutally honest. It's always the person who's delivering the message who's like, well, I'm just being brutally honest. That translates to, I don't care about your feelings. I'm going to tell you whatever way that I want to. You take it how. I think that's really irresponsible in the way that we handle people.
I think brutal honesty sometimes is the best policy. Sometimes. And sometimes and maybe that's coming from a male perspective, because sometimes if you're not brutally honest with some brothers, your relationship or your interactions with them sometimes get stagnant or they don't go anywhere. And sometimes brothers won't move to do things that they're supposed to do unless you're brutally honest. So I can sit here and admit my bias, probably being a guy. I prefer brutal, honest. Let the feelings come or whatever. Because the thing is I want to get what the true meat and potatoes of the situation is. And if you're sitting here just trying to be tactful and try to do this, that, and the third, which is nice, it's cool that you want to care about my feelings, but I want to get down to the bottom of what it is that you're talking about instead of us dancing around this nonsense. Like, I think that also speaks to your point of that too many people are dancing around trying to give the roundabout way of trying to say XYZ instead of just being like, rip the bandage off. Like, it's not going to feel good. You might not even survive the conversation. And I don't think you should always rip the bandage off like that. But like, I think there is some good value to being brutally honest so that you can get rid of a lot of the fluff that people are accustomed to feeling on a day-to-day basis, in my opinion.
Mhm.